Welcome to the No Water, No Hospitals conversation. I'll introduce our panelists in a moment. I was going to play a video. We will certainly tweet it or share it in a bit. I'll just do a little bit of verbal framing and a guided imagination tour to frame this. So hopefully you saw Bryson and I open earlier, and I showed a water hammer and a cascading failure where no water, no hospital. We've assembled a team here to look at some pretty diverse angles on what that cross-sector cascading failure could look like and how it might be managed under fire. I want you to close your eyes for a moment. This will be short. I want you to picture your hospital. Imagine the name of that hospital. How far away is it from your house? Is it 5 minutes away, 20 minutes away? When was the last time you were at this hospital? Was it to welcome a newborn into the world? Say goodbye to a friend? Do you take a loved one to the emergency room? Were you scared? Did you get the care you needed when you needed it? Now, I want you to imagine that hospital again, and I want you to imagine that hospital is not available to you for some reason. Where would you go instead? Do you know your next nearest hospital? Is it east? Is it west? Is it in the same town? Is it the town over? Is it the county over? Is it 200 miles away, like is often the case in most of America? What if that's also down because it's owned by the same conglomerate or private equity firm? What if it's also down because we had water disruptions in many parts of the US? This is very personal. We've done studies. When I was running the Cystic COVID task force, we proved the first statistical proof of loss of life, that delayed and degraded access to care had worsened outcomes and elevated mortality rates for heart, brain, and pulmonary, where minutes, like 4.4 minute longer ambulance ride, affected heart survival rates after 30 days. With strokes, the golden hour is 1, 3, or 4 hours could be the difference if you walk again, talk again, if you even survive. The golden hour is a rough rule of thumb for several medical conditions. You're going to hear from Natalie Sullivan, an emergency physician, later today in track 2. She'll talk about the time sensitivity of certain conditions and how quickly the hospital shuts down and why. So these things, we know that ransoms can introduce enough of a delay that 4.4 minute threshold, the 1 hour threshold, the 4 hour threshold, and worsen outcomes. In fact, colleagues of mine, Dr. Christian Nemeth, Jeff Tully, who we co-founded CyberMed Summit with, they've now done peer-reviewed published studies that show even if your hospital is not ransomed, the people who live in that zip code or county can have worsened outcomes because the blast radius, the overflow of other patients being pushed to other facilities, affects your outcome even if your hospital was not directly attacked. In fact, the most stunning follow-up is that for heart conditions with favorable outcomes, you had a 10-fold decrease in favorable outcomes just by being in a community that had some hospital affected, even if it wasn't yours. So this should be personal. And those disruptions are irrespective of cause. It could be a ransom attack, it could be a power outage, it could be a water disruption at scale. And if you're thinking about where you would go if your hospital is down, what if they too are down? So we've assembled a pretty motley crew, I would say, and I'm going to ask the questions in a little order, but take the idea, immerse yourself and say it is now 2027. China had said, if you interfere with Taiwan, we're going to deter and undermine public support for your intervention. And with the current access they have and maintain for pre-positioning, for living off the land, we either get a small demonstration of force or all-out disruption. What will we do under fire? So I'm going to have each of these panelists running down the line introduce themselves for 30 seconds. Then I'm going to have some pretty hard questions, and I want you to prepare hard questions as well. Why don't you start, Blake?
Hi, so my name is Blake Scott. I am a senior disaster planner for a public health department in Arizona. So my job is to respond to, recover from, and prepare for disasters like wildfires, snowstorms, and COVID. Maybe you heard of that one. I have 7 years of experience in responding to all of these events. And then a small disclaimer, I do not represent the positions of my government. I'm speaking on myself right now. So these positions are my own. Take it up with me.
Hi, good afternoon. First off, thank you for the invitation, Josh, to be on this panel. My name is Jonathan Horowitz. I'm a legal advisor and the deputy head of the legal department of the International Committee of the Red Cross's regional delegation for the United States and Canada. Some of you may know the ICRC. We're not the American Red Cross. The American Cross is wonderful, but the ICRC is a Swiss-based organization that works to protect and provide humanitarian assistance to civilians and other victims of armed conflict. We're a neutral, independent, and impartial organization, so I'm not pro one government or anti another government. I would say that the ICRC is pro humanity, and as we'll discuss, is also pro international humanitarian law, and we'll get into that later. Thanks.
There we go. Jennifer Walker, Director of Infrastructure Cyber Defense for the Water ISAC. I think most of this audience knows what ISACs do and are, so I'll leave it at that, I think, unless you want more background.
Kevin Morley with the American Water Works Association. Just got back from sitting with 11,000 of my friends in the sector where we had some robust discussions about this, so happy to be here with Josh and talk about the importance of what happens when there's no water.
Okay, so we have a lot of questions and I want to leave room for some of yours. So we're going to hit hard. It's going to come faster than we want it to do. And so I want your brilliant answers here. But Blake, I'm going to start with you. All crisis management is local. So let's assume the analysis we talked about with undisruptible happens some point 2027 plus or minus. We get a brushback pitch. There's some unavailability or even physical damage to our water facilities, leading your hospitals in your county, your community. What do you do? What does it look like immediately? And then are you even looking cross-sector for public health versus power versus water?
Yeah. Okay.
What does your world look like?
Yeah. So hospitals are this really unique organizations of dependencies that have just-in-time delivery that results in people dying if they don't come together in the exact right time. So any major disruption of care results in brain loss or heart loss or death. And so we just experienced, actually, in my community, a water event. It was an internal water event at a hospital that we serve inside of my jurisdiction. The closest nearest facility was 40 minutes away. What that looks like is first the hospital called us. And they said, hey, we're experiencing this internal water event and we're going to evacuate the hospital. So this is a small facility, about 30 patients. So they called us and then we contacted the Healthcare Coalition. So across the nation, there are these organizations called Healthcare Coalitions, and they spun up to try and locate where are these patients going to go. We didn't activate the full emergency operations center to respond to this event. It wasn't necessary. It was an internal emergency. So it took us about 2 days to find beds for 30 patients. For a large hospital facility, like a 200-bed hospital facility in our community, that would take forever to potentially find beds for these patients. So that's really hard. And then just thinking about my largest facility, the closest peer level care is 2.5 hours by ground. So if I lose water at that facility, that is a major concern. And I have no other hospital in my community. So regarding your second question, which is, how do I think about it? So hospitals are made up of these 4 things. They're made up of stuff, staff, space, and services. Those services are the dependencies, like the power, the water, the medical gas, that kind of stuff. And so all 4 of those things are necessary for a hospital. So if you break any of those chains, it results in problems. And so my job is to find out when those hospitals have gaps in those services or staff or stuff, and then fill those gaps using public resources or private resources across the entire community. And so that's that'll get you started.
I hope we're going to get to some incident command since this point as
yes.
well. All right, so let's zoom out. So you have a crisis in many of your hospitals in your patch, in your state. You're going to be doing some sort of triage we'll learn about. Let's zoom out a little bit more. ISACs exist for right of boom. Something bad has happened. You're a resource to your members. We know there's about what, we're going to debate this a little bit at some point, but there's 151,000 water facilities, a different count of wastewater. 50,000 of those, a third, are servicing homes. Some of them are servicing more people than others, but a subset of those 6,000 have hospitals that they support. And this is not a complaint. You're my vital teammate, but there's only 650 members in the ISAC, and if you do the math, that's 0.4% of the water facilities. Kevin, we're gonna get to Kevin in a minute. He's got 4,000 members, so 1.4%. We have some participation, which is great, but as these hospital communities, as his citizens in his state or county are calling upon help, what is the role of the ISAC?
So the role of the ISAC is to keep our members or whoever we can reach updated on what the threats are, hopefully proactively. So we're watching the threats, we're watching the threat landscape across. All of the ISACs are kind of looking holistically across the threat landscape, and then we're distilling down what's most important for our members and then sharing out that information for our sector members. Again, proactively doing that, but then also, keeping track of tracking the information is a full-time job, and only really the large utilities in our respect can really watch the threat landscape on their own. But they're still relying on us kind of to distill giving that executive overview and what they can pass along.
And since many of these are target-rich cyber poor, or there's no mandates yet, do you feel they're prepared for nation state adversaries, or is it more traditional ransomware?
Well, for the cyber poor, they're kind of not prepared for any of it. I wanted to point out, we track the threats and risks across all hazards, so physical, natural, health, cyber. Many of our members, like I said, are using the information, they're using it from the physical threat perspective, but we do have the mediums and the larges that are more, I'll call them cyber responsible. The more mature resource utilities are cognizant and being, and prepared for any threat actor, threat cluster, threat activity. In the past, kind of around the Shields Up campaign, if you will, I've called it the Three Musketeers approach, kind of the all for one for all. With few exceptions, at least from my perspective, I don't see most of the threat actors doing anything unique. Then they don't have to be, because the common behaviors keep working. So why invest in new attack vectors when you don't have to? And if I may be bold, and I think it's been alluded to, even Volt Typhoon, right? What are they actually doing? At least, again, from my perspective, maybe CISA can explain, or Microsoft or Palo Alto, what are they doing that's different? I propose they're just doing it better, because one of their goals is to lay low and lurk and remain undetected. And they're very patient, and they're doing that very well, which is why they're such a threat. But because many utilities lack visibility, but I contend that the Three Musketeers idea is that if you're reactively protecting systems against the one, like the Russia or the China, you'll be better prepared for any other attack that comes up. But if you're proactively protecting against the majority of the threats out there, the all, if you will, then you'll already be better prepared for that one, i.e. right now, Volt Typhoon. So to get back to the question, sorry about that. I think the members, those cyber, advanced cyber prepared members, they do feel prepared to take on, I would say take on a nation state, but as my cybersecurity advisory committee co-chair, who is here today and will be speaking later, reminded me of a Mike Tyson quote that I recently used. Everyone thinks they're ready until they get punched in the face. So the wise ones understand they aren't perfect, but they continue to improve visibility and defenses. But again, for those rural, they don't have visibility into their systems. They don't have the resources, and that's a much different story. It's not that they aren't willing, but we need to take the controls and the solutions to them in their communities where they're at. Because there are a lot of solutions and controls out there, but this isn't Field of Dreams. The rural water isn't coming. But they are responding when someone they trust, such as, I'll say, National Rural Water Association, brings the solutions and helps them in their communities. And in that vein, pardon the cliche, what keeps me up at night is kind of goes back to our secure by design, resilient by design talk before, which I love, by the way. I'm a huge fan. But what keeps me up at night are integrators and service providers. This is where my concern is, who don't do cyber, but more concerning are the small utilities who are assuming those service providers are providing cybersecurity, and they don't know how, or they don't know how to hold those providers accountable. And as I said, this usually leads me into my secure by design default and demand soapbox, but we had SZA up here earlier, Kirk, and I've seen Matt Rogers here, so I'll leave it at that. But in the 12 to 18 months, we need to get more tech boots on the ground that do cyber, that understand water, and are trusted by the utilities to help keep these smaller rural utilities safe.
And we're going to, thank you. We're going to keep zooming out. So if the ISACs tend to do the tactical and the technical resource support, Kevin, certain sectors have the sector coordinating council. I looked high and low. You seem to be the one who's got the longest view and the most strategic view for the business side, the executive side. So what's the role of AWA and your network of networks in this type of crisis under fire?
It just means I've been in town too long. Yeah, so certainly very involved with our sector coordinating council and trying to push the rope on cybersecurity in the water sector for the better part of a decade or 15 years. And I think kind of just coming back to one of the conversations before, we do an annual state of the industry report. 10, 15 years ago, cybersecurity wasn't on the list. As of the most recent version that just came out last week, I believe we sort of cracked the awareness nut a little bit. So 73% of systems that responded, statistically significant, indicated that cybersecurity and data privacy was their top priority. That's a big deal. However, the caveat is that 26% of the small systems responding, getting to your cyber rich or the poverty line thing, said they don't have capacity. And so what we've been trying to do to address that is to provide guidance based on the NIST cybersecurity framework to address and really focus with the new version of that guidance and on the what we would call the first mile, their fundamentals, and really push some of the points we heard earlier of getting to that point of focusing. There's lots of different things you can do if you just do some of these basic hygiene things, and ISAC's got a list and others, but getting them to really kind of crystallize on those things and get that stuff off the board, take the keys off the dashboard kind of stuff, I think we can go a long way. But I do think that there's a critical necessity to evaluate some force multiplier kind of concepts in getting technical capacity in the field. Right? Everybody's kind of rowing their own boat right now. We need to come together and get that skill set on the ground in the next 12 to 18 months and enable them to take on some of these fundamentals and get that done.
So zooming out to the really big level, we're going to get to why is the international laws of armed conflict even on stage? So I would argue, and I've been doing public-private partnership for a while across the 16 designated critical infrastructure sectors, again, across the 55 national critical functions. We tend to look at this as peacetime criminal activity, maybe espionage to steal stuff. Now we're talking about warfare and hybrid conflict. So from your perspective at the macro level, and I know you're not taking sides on any one given country, like why did I put the Red Cross concept and the international laws of armed conflict recognized by all these countries? Why are you here? How should we be looking at this?
No, thanks. And listening to how Blake in particular thinks about different components of critical infrastructure and how there can be a domino effect if one of those four sort of components falls apart is very similar to how the International Committee of the Red Cross thinks about critical infrastructure as well. So if we do zoom back, I mean, what the ICRC is seeing in terms of the digital sort of ecosystem with regard to armed conflict, right? We're seeing things that you're all seeing, which is increased numbers and sophistications of military cyber tools and capabilities that can be used in armed conflict situations. We're seeing a increase in the development of cyber commands within governments. We're seeing the increased democratization of this technology, down pricing and proliferation of these tools into the hands of civilians, right, who now can be actors. It was something that came up in Bryson's interview in terms of cyber does not know geographic boundaries or international borders the way other means and methods of warfare often do. And we're also seeing greater demands for public-private partnerships. So the point is you have more actors and more tools and capabilities being used on the battlefield that can disrupt essential services that are reliant on digital infrastructure. And from the ICRC's perspective, we're really thinking about the exact same things that you're all thinking about. We're thinking about water, we're thinking about electricity, we're thinking about health, we're thinking about transport, we're thinking about agriculture, we're thinking about supply chains, all things that are absolutely necessary for civilians to get the essential services that allow them to live in a highly vulnerable environment with regard to warfare, right? So taking away any of those essential services can be detrimental life and limb to any of us today. You move into a context of armed conflict and the stakes are much, much higher. The other thing that is really helpful about the sort of the taxonomy, if you will, of what Blake had put out is that it importantly moves the conversation or combines the cyber vulnerability conversation to the physical vulnerability realm, right? And so what you can have is you can not only have vulnerabilities with regard to digital infrastructure, but at the same time, say in peacetime, you can also have a hurricane or you can have natural disaster that puts a tax on the physical infrastructure that then compounds the problems that you have with regard to cyber vulnerabilities and different malicious actors. Now, this brings me finally to the reason why international humanitarian law or the law of armed conflict or the laws of war are relevant to this stage. And I think for this audience, the thing that I want you to sort of remember or take away is first and foremost, this body of law does apply to cyber actors engage in activities that are connected to armed conflict, right? So it regulates what they do, just like it regulates a warfighter with an AK-47 or a military Air Force pilot who's considering to drop a bomb on a military objective or on a hospital. The rules say you can't drop that bomb on a hospital. Same it goes for cyber actors. A cyber actor in an armed conflict can't direct attacks against a hospital. It's prohibited. So one thing to remember is that critical infrastructure or essential services that are devoted solely to civilians are protected under international humanitarian law from attack. The other thing that's very critical for this audience to remember, and again, it was touched on before, is that in this interconnected digital world we live in, a lot of times those essential services that go to civilians are built on the digital backbone of infrastructure that also provides services to militaries. And so the question is, under what conditions can that digital infrastructure also become a military objective? Because an adversary is really going after the fuel and the electricity that's going to militaries, even though incidentally, it may impact the fuel and the electricity, which also services water plants and hospitals that civilians rely on. And so one of the things that I would sort of challenge this audience to do if they haven't done it already is when you map out your different risk assessments, include in it whether or not you think you're going to be a higher vulnerability in a situation of conflict, because you may also be providing support to militaries, or your infrastructure without necessarily knowing it may be providing support to militaries and what that means. Now, that's not a comment on the lawfulness of doing it. That's just how the systems work these days. And if we're talking about risk, the ICRC is here to say that's part of the risk assessment.
All right. I've heard this 5 times now, and I'm still getting very stressed out every time you say it. So in my own words, and I'm probably butchering this, but I'm trying to connect. This is their first time hearing this. The little red cross on someone's hospital building is basically it's illegal to bomb this thing. the Red Cross on a soldier's helmet for, someone aiding on an active battlefield, even as far back as World War I and before, gives you safe passage to care for the wounded. It's a do not attack this thing. But in a hyper-connected, very entangled, complex mesh, they may not realize that cyber bombing a water facility can, in fact, cross over into disrupting that safe, protected logo of the Red Cross. So that is mind-blowing thing number one. Just look at Stuxnet. That was a very targeted attack, but instead, tomorrow you're going to hear from Andy Greenberg, Wired. He wrote a book called Sandworm, and he did all the coverage on the NotPetya attacks. NotPetya was meant to only hit Ukrainian businesses, but it escaped its intended blast radius and did $10 billion of damage in a day, $1 billion on US soil at Merck by accident, right? So we don't have clean blast radius in cyber the way we do. We'll hear more about that from Andy tomorrow, but the other mind-blowing part here is 0 water facilities I've talked to, and we're going to flip this to you two for your networks, but 0 water facilities I've talked to have done sort of triage to say, am I already a legitimate target of war because of who I serve in my water plant? So how are your communities considering this wartime? Do we even get briefings on international rules of armed conflict in either the ISAC or the AWA? Please respond to his mind-blowing idea bombs.
I'm going to invite him to speak.
Okay.
No, we haven't covered international armed conflict laws.
Well, what I can tell you is that the month before Pearl Harbor, in the journal AWA, it was a fascinating article from one J. Edgar Hoover about the vulnerabilities of water systems to what we called then saboteurs. It wasn't really in the context of, it was in the context of armed conflict as things were escalating in Europe and the Pacific. So we have talked about it. We're not talking about it specifically right now. Mm-hmm. However, drinking water systems, within the cuts of the water systems, so about 10,000 community water systems that serve about 90% of the US population. So systems over 3,300 population served are required to do risk assessments that evaluate malevolent and natural hazard risks to their systems, including cyber risks. It's not framed in the conflict or in the context of armed conflict or warfare to that point, but so systems are evaluating that. Certainly if they have a critical customer like a DoD installation or something like that, that is a recognized critical customer or Trauma One Center or something like that. That's part of their mission, right? At the end of the day, a water utilities mission is public health and safety, right? Fire service, hospitals, and just, it is the one utility that comes into your house. Hopefully you all used it this morning before you came here for our benefit, that you consume unquestioned, right? So we have a different mission. So we do think about it, but maybe not exactly as we just talked about it.
I certainly think we have the opportunity to do something about that in the next 12 to 18 months.
Maybe I'm going to advocate for all water systems to get the Red Cross on her.
Anything else?
I was just going to say, yeah, for systems 3,300 or over, they are required, but for 3,300 and under, they're not. So from our perspective, we're encouraging them to voluntarily do these things. As is Kevin's organization, yes, 40,000 systems. To that end, the rural systems don't have any visibility, which is why, and we don't have access to them. We only have that 650 membership, which includes utilities, but also includes vendors and some government. But which is why Water ISAC partnered with the National Rural Water Association earlier last year to help reach their smaller utilities, those 3,300 and under, to help spread that message. But, there's a lot of systems and, it is challenging to reach them, but 12 to 18 months, it's taking time to reach all of them. I've spoken at 2 Rural Water Association conferences, state conferences this year. And I was at their in-service last week, which talked to the kind of the boots on the ground, their circuit riders and their trainers and stuff, not the actual utilities themselves. So there's only, a few of us, right? And it takes time to cover.
many of us know what the circuit riders are, and I hope to get to that soon. But next, we're going to go back to you full circle. Your first question was basically like, we're under fire. What do you do? But a lot of your job is left of boom. It's planning, it's understanding the interdependencies. It's maybe prioritizing, if you can't restore every community, which ones are more important. How does your role, maybe not your specific government that you're not representing today, but your profession look at how to handle a singleton, like a single outage, like you referred to in your example, versus widespread concurrent? How do you look at prioritization, interdependencies? This is a whole science that I'm only starting to learn about.
Yeah, so we're not defenseless. Like, this is a lot of doom and gloom, but we're not completely defenseless. I want to talk to this man about like war targets, because that was not in my risk assessment. Initially, like, we're changing it. We're like, oh yeah, we might be a target. Oopsie. So we're not completely defensive. There's a couple different systems that we're using to kind of understand the critical infrastructure. So in my world, we don't even use like the CISA critical infrastructure list. Like, I didn't even know that existed until like 3 years ago. So we actually use something called the emergency support functions, as well as the FEMA community lifelines. This separates American society into 7 different sectors that are really important for American society. And so when we have an interruption of those, and we have key metrics that we can ask our critical infrastructure partners, hey, what is going on in your system? And then we can flag those as yellow or flag those as red, and then we can start fixing those problems. And so key thing for us is to restore the services if unable, and then support the service that it currently exists to bring it back into green. So how do we do that? We use something called the National Incident Management System inside the business. We use this across the entire country. I just went to a public health conference. We all talk about the incident management system. It's a really standardized way to approach disaster events. We have role-based responsibilities. We have a structure. And so this is how we manage hurricanes, wildfires, snowstorms, all of that. Incident management system. You can pick me up, take me over to New York. We'll all speak the same language. So we have a process in place. Now, these larger impacts, these are hard to handle. And we, as a community of emergency management practitioners, we haven't really gotten to cybersecurity as a community event yet. We currently view it as an internal event. I don't. I think it's a community disaster that causes cascading failures. But we, as an emergency management community, have not yet gotten to that place. So,
all right. I'm going to go a little bit off script just to maintain the flow. Thus far, whenever we've been having these conversations in the pilot for this first year, there's a few people. All right, I'm not going to say a few. Every single conversation devolves into one of the following 5 objections, because it's uncomfortable for us to think about this being a target of war, having cascading failures, having more than one attack at once. So without going through this in this presentation, I may hint at it in my own track 2 talk. Maybe some of you in the audience, as you're trying to think of your questions, have thought about, well, why would I be a target? Or aren't I insured? Or we have mutual assistance relationships across the sector. So if there's wildfires in LA, people from Wisconsin will fly in to help, and they know how to through this common lexicon. Maybe some of you were thinking like that. Why 2027? Who would actually do this? And there are answers to all those, but maybe let's try to like stress test those. And I almost put, instead of until I met you, I almost had Cyber AccuView here, which is the top underwriters of cyber insurance, all 20 of them. And I've done workshops with them. We started a new special interest group. This is either an act of war and excluded from your coverage. Your insurance will not help you. And or it's a disruption based on a service outage or utility outage, which is also not covered. So everyone that says it won't happen to me, if it happens to me, we're insured. Maybe if we're really in trouble, we'll call on mutual aid. We've tested most of those assumptions, and they fall apart pretty fast. So this isn't to add to the doom and gloom. It's really just to say, I think many of you know this, part of what we put in Undisruptible Phase 2 is we want to do some cross-sector crisis simulations and exercises, because to quote the late, great Dan Kaminsky, Of all the things that hackers smash, perhaps the most important are assumptions. So I think for those in the room that don't want to be spectators, part of why we're driving so much here at Critical Effect is to see if you can help create that mean time to aha and challenge those assumptions, at least in your state or your community, leveraging the resources you have up here, just so that we don't hope we're ready, but we have some game plan on, if I can't restore every water facility, can I maybe prioritize the trauma centers or the zip codes that have fewer alternatives nearby? So a little off script, but if we try to bring this back in, we've got about, let's just say 10 minutes to aim for between our thoughts here and any audience questions. So please bring your audience question now. But my colleague Bo Woods tomorrow is going to run the Cyber Policy Shark Tank. We're going to pitch the best 3 ideas from the 20 or so we've had submitted. Not going to assume that you can come up with one on the fly, but maybe while we're taking some field questions here, if you could wave a magic wand and get something in front of Congress, maybe it doesn't work within 12 to 18 months, but what is the single best thing that could better prepare us over the next 12 to 18 months to best serve our communities? It's rhetorical. You might have a question answer. Do you have one?
I do have several answers, but so there are several bills that are on the floor, or not on the floor, but have been introduced. I wouldn't call any of them immediate term kind of solutions. So setting those aside for a minute, some of them are creating some more kind of what I call institutionalized support for better information sharing or circuit riders, which could have near-term immediate effects versus some longer-term things. But I really think that the technical assistance that some of our federal partners have capacity to support, rather than doing it independently, need to leverage trusted partners in the sector like AWWA or the Rural Water Association, some of the other associations, and have a unified force multiplying effect, just like we had it after 9/11. We go out, get butts in the chair, and enable people to evaluate their threats and their vulnerabilities. We've developed resources. CISA's got resources. ISAC's got resources. We need to get people on the table so that they understand their role and function of this national security threat, create some urgency, and empower them to address those minimum kind of cyber hygiene things that we heard in the last segment.
This might be a good time to say, what is a circuit rider and what is a cyber circuit rider?
A circuit rider is basically a technical assistance person that is out in the field, go visit a utility and say, I don't know how to do MFA. I hear you. I don't know how to do the how part. So they can be there to help actually do that. There's a couple of different ways to do that. Jen's been involved with Rural Water that is one of the organizations that provides that service.
I was going to say that the Circuit Rider program is kind of specific to National Rural Water Association. It started with physical. So the circuit riders they themselves are water operators in a lot of cases, or engineers, and then they can provide through the funding that NRWA gets free assistance, technical assistance for anything. I mean, grant writing for infrastructure improvements, just anything. And then more recently, November of last year, NRWA got funding through a USDA grant to pilot a cybersecurity circuit rider program. So similarly, the cybersecurity circuit riders are also operators and have worked in utilities and the like. But there's only 2 of them. The pilot program only impacts 2 states, Oregon and Vermont. And so the goal is they're trying to wrap more with the USDA Farm Bill and other efforts to try to get that expanded to the rest of the states.
So I'm not saying these are linked, but in the vicinity of this idea of cyber circuit riders, we're going to have enough people that can do that will scale. And this seems like a good time to say, in the various things that the philanthropic community is funded, we have Ann Cleveland in the back with the clinics out of Berkeley and across the country. These cyber clinics can maybe take the indigenous talent and give them exposure to different cybersecurity things. She's also helping to lead the nonprofit cyber resilience core, where we're asking people like you in the room, will you sign up to be someone who's willing and able to help on certain topics for certain durations and certain geographies? So perhaps we could become the volunteer firefighters or the volunteer circuit riders that could be done this in the next 12 to 18 months. These could be follow-ups for our nice panelists here. And one of the talks we invited for water is DEF CON Franklin. The DEF CON conference has a Franklin project. They've done 6 pilots. One of those pilots was presenting on how they helped cyber up a particular water facility. You're also going to hear from Gus later today, a professional engineer in the water sector who is talking about engineering down consequences for specific things like water hammers. If you want to know how he does it, we're going to hear from Ginger on consequence-informed engineering. So a lot of these things will only work if you're an active participant or if our friends and colleagues in this industry are active participants. So those are not the only ways to contribute, but if any of those spark your heart, find us later. All right, you had an answer to the challenge.
So, 2 things that I wanted to raise, and it was Bryson, you had raised it earlier, is that the ICRC has been working on the implications of military cyber operations, armed conflict for about 20 years. And as everyone knows in this room, it's very hard for someone who's not in this work to imagine what the actual consequences are, even though it's very easy for us to imagine what the consequences are. And so one of the things that we've been noticing, which is why, Josh, the work that you're doing on causation, more than correlation, but causation, that's where the data crunch is really important. So a lot of people talk about cyber attacks or cyber operations, malicious cyber activities, and they sort of stop at, oh, someone got into our system, as if that's the problem. From the ICRC's perspective, sure, that's a problem. But our problem that we want to solve is, well, what does that mean for civilian access to water, to health, to electricity? And how do you quantify that in terms of harm, right? And so it's not numbers of intruders per second that means anything to the ICRC or really to the general public when you're trying to explain why this problem needs to be solved. It's issues like a uptick in vulnerable communities that have been disenfranchised, that don't have good hospital services, that really get hit hard when there is a ransomware attack on a hospital, for example. So that's one thing that I want to mention. The other, and this is more at the international level, but the ICRC has been working on what it's calling a digital emblem. And so there is the physical Red Cross, Red Crescent, Red Crystal that some of you may know is sort of patched onto the ICRC's vehicles to mark that we're protected from attack. It's also used to be put on military medical facilities, tents, clinics, same thing for civilian medical facilities. But of course, all those things, including the ICRC and other parts of the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, rely on digital assets to be able to do that work, including hospitals, hospital equipment, communication systems, files, records, et cetera. And so we're trying to come up with a way to put a marking on the digital assets so that when cyber operators are in a conflicted environment, looking around an adversary's network, they will know that that is a no-go area, that you cannot go after something that has that particular marking on it. And so it's at the IETF. There's a working group specifically on coming up with standards for a digital emblem, but it's not going to be ready in 12 to 18 months, but it is a forward-looking sort of technical solution to a physical problem that the ICRC is working on with states, with the tech sector, and with others.
Yeah, and last offer for questions. We still have a little bit of time, but I'm going to keep going. Can someone get that gentleman a microphone? And then front row. As we're moving the microphone, I know you can't say this, but I will emote, and I'm not as averse as you. This is why a lot of people ask you, why do you care so much, Josh, about Volt Typhoon? There's so many typhoons, Salt Typhoon, Flax Typhoon, all these different attacks. Why do you care so much? And it's this notion that whether they don't realize, the attackers don't realize it or don't care. If you were to bomb a hospital, it's a clear violation. What they've got is virtual bombs on water that have almost the exact effect on civilians at that hospital. So this is so outrageous and dangerous a game we're playing. And whether it's this panel right here or Mark Montgomery is going to kind of talk about force mobilization, there are only a handful of these lifeline critical infrastructures that really are target rich, cyber poor, and need a lot more help the next 12 to 18 months. So let's try to do a speed round. I might hear a few questions, then we'll integrate them together. You first, sir.
Okay. Yikes.
Uh-oh.
Is that better? No, that is not better.
I have a big mouth. I'll repeat it. Yeah.
In the vein of 12 to 18 months. I'm the founder of CoStream. My name is Greg Martz. We're a member of Water ISAC. We're a member of American Water. We're National Rural Water. We're in all those things. And we are the technical capacity in the field. That's what we are. So my number one question, number one impact is, what are the programs? What are the grant programs? What are the funds that are available now that our clients, these disadvantaged communities who don't have any money, who don't have any technical resources, where's the list of the money and how to get it?
Thank you.
That's it.
Want to ask the front question and we'll integrate these together? Yeah. Is there a third hand? So the front row here? And then second row. Hi,
Amina Rogers here with the Innovation Department at Crowell. My question is for Jonathan. So I was curious about the marker, this cyber emblem. How's it going to manifest given like all the layers and stuff that cyber attackers can see when they go into systems and infrastructure? And then related to that, just given because I'm in this field now, switching from humanitarian now to this area, do you have thoughts on how attorneys in the AI sector can support some of these efforts on an international level in terms of the humanitarian laws and laws of armed conflict?
Third row, and then I'll synthesize. Which one? I didn't see who was first.
So a question and a quick statement. So I'm also on the Water ISAC Advisory Committee. One thing that we've been advocating for is mentorship. So big utilities helping small utilities. And I think that's a great way to really put that out there for all sectors, but something that we really should be focused on. I think there's a lot of return on investment and it doesn't take a whole lot of time to do that. But the other thing I wanted to ask as a general question of the panel, and we're talking in the context of hospitals here, is we're talking drinking water. We're not talking wastewater. And wastewater has a huge impact when it comes to hospitals. And we want to make sure that we address that as part of the overall concept here. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about that.
I was going to say that too.
Yeah, that was a scoping choice by attrition. All right, so we have a few minutes to wrap about this. I'll start with one answer to the first question, which is whether we like it or not, there has been an executive order to reload, balance, and shift more burden for these types of topics to the states. And whether coordinated or not, there was a second thing that says, okay, fine, if that's what it is, we could adapt. But there was also a retraction of funding for the multi-state ISAC, which may help in that transition. And a lot of the grants have either been paused or eliminated. So not a great answer for getting money. And that's one of the reasons we asked Gus to speak later today, because a lot of the physical mitigations to these cyber exposures are engineering in nature and much more cost effective with existing resources and talent pool. Not great, but think of this as what can we do immediately with low cost, smarter consequence management while we crawl, walk, run on some of those grants. They're not free, but neither are replacing water mains. So there may be other answers to that, but just go on. We'll just start with you and come back this way for all three questions.
So the first and foremost, the one that actually exists and has resources is the state revolving loan funds for both drinking water and wastewater systems. Cybersecurity is an eligible activity. What's complicated about that is whether or not the asset or the function that you're trying to support from a cyber perspective is considered CapEx versus OpEx. It's OpEx. It's a subscription to AWS or something because that's obviously going to give you more security benefits. That's not included at the moment. So that's a policy issue that we need to think about a little bit differently. There is the state and state and local cybersecurity grant program that I know some water systems were able to take advantage of. I'm not quite sure what the cycle is on that, but again, the systems that we're talking about that have the least capacity are not going to go through all of the stuff to get to this. Then that's a problem. That's where circuit riders and others can help, or maybe yourself. The BRIC program at FEMA, which I believe is timed out at the moment, that has some possibility to support this. But again, it's not, there's a lot of red tape. So the systems that we really need to have the support have the least capacity to go after these resources. There's a few others that we can talk about more, but those are the principal sources. Again, none of that's, well, with the exception of BRIC, but the SRF programs alone, we are rate-based organizations. We can't go flip, the price of water like the gas station can. It's locked in. You got to go to the city board or PUC or something like that. So, it's tough. It's rate-based, and we've got about $6 billion in new regulatory obligations for PFAS and lead and copper. So utilities are super stressed on their budget. And that doesn't mean that we don't do this stuff. I'm just saying there's a lot of pressure on the sector.
Right. 30 seconds each.
I don't have much. I just wanted to kind of echo what was said about, we're talking about water, but think it is applicable to wastewater as well. And then, from the kind of, I call it a be a good neighbor, where I challenge the more cyber mature utilities to take the rural utilities under their wing and be a mentor. And to be quite frank, the gentleman that stated that is one of my biggest proponents in that, and really talks to a lot of systems. So it's hugely successful from my perspective for what he does. So thank you.
Two things. Thanks for the questions. I would say any lawyers that are working in the ICT field that have companies that are providing services in situations of armed conflict, if this sort of talk resonates with you, come and talk to the ICRC and we can sort of walk you through some of these issues if you're not super familiar with them. With regard to there, because there are some fascinating issues, right? So there are debates around whether or not loss of functionality that doesn't result in physical damage, which is something that happens in the cyber environment quite often, whether that receives the full robust application of different rules of international humanitarian law. There are questions around data as an object, and there's special protections and very robust protections for objects and civilian objects in particular. So come and talk to us. With regard to the digital emblem, ETH Zurich did a lot of the heavy lifting on this for the ICRC. I can refer you to the paper that provides the different considerations that they walk through. I will say one of the things that has to happen for this project to be successful from a legal and operational perspective is that it has to mark very specific things, right? So it can't mark an entire forward operating bases network. It needs to be very specific around the medical services of the military. So there are different ways that we were challenged by that and different solutions that try to address that particular issue. But thanks for the questions.
So you asked where the money is, and it's limited right now. There are some grant funding, but you've seen the budgets. So the State Homeland Grants programs, State Homeland Security Grant Program, I don't know your specific local context, so it depends on your state. The Emergency Management Performance Grant, that will help you with at least doing training exercising, because that's your emergency management local agency that could set up an exercise for you, or a training for you. The Public Health Emergency Preparedness Cooperative Agreement, this is not money to you, unfortunately. These two are grant funded for your local community to help your facility do exercises, do training, do coordination. And then the other one is a hazard mitigation plan. That is money direct. It's a 4-to-1. So you got to pony up 25% and they pony up 75%. But there's very little state and local funds. There are no state and local grants in my state to water utilities to support rip and replace or any of these particular activities that you want to do.
I hope these folks have whetted your appetites, piqued your interest. There are other fantastic talks for the next day or two, day and a half. And I wasn't going to say this, but I was a contestant in the first Shark Tank back in January. It was off the record. My simple pitch had pretty bipartisan, bicameral support. And I would basically said out of this 151,000 water facilities and communities, 6,000 of them support hospitals. Can we create a fund to assess, exercise, and render resilient the continuity of operations of the pressure zone servicing those 6,000 hospitals? So reimbursable funds for this, and there had been interest. So yes, there was a changing of the inauguration and committee selection and things, but there is some interest in a very laser targeted thing. So if you're looking at fixing all the towns, I don't think there's appetite. If you're looking at being incredibly surgical, like resilience of the pressure zone of a hospital, there's quite a bit of appetite, and we can continue to use tools like Shark Tank, like DEF CON, like our East Side's Las Vegas track, where I hope to get this gang back together. We have to figure out what they are, prioritize them, sort them, and triage them, and connect you with volunteers and services through things like Cyber Resilience Corps. So I'm hoping you both become a volunteer or mentor, or start to leverage the volunteers and mentors. But this is not the end of the conversation, it's the beginning. And I'll let you go back to lunch, I believe is next. And feel free to corner these fine folks. And I think he left the room, but if you see Silas Cutler, got a Stuxnet shirt on, if I had seen his publication before, I would have put him up here as a presenter, but he just released this term at CISA called "Get Your Stuff Off Search," because I couldn't publish the 4-letter word I wanted to say. But it was say your assets are showing online, see what your adversaries can see, use Shodan and Census.io, see cyber physical systems with no passwords. It's not about multi-factor authentication. There's no authentication. So he just helped privately the EPA identify 400 HMIs directly exposed on the internet and get them quietly closed down. We have to do this pretty routinely, but the data is pretty stunning. So even if we're doing the right best hygiene, often it's our suppliers and our legacy tech that's exposing us. And that's going to have to be part of the mix as well. So if you see a Stuxnet t-shirt, corner him and go read that report. Thank you for your time. We're only halfway done the first day. Congratulate yourselves.